listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by Nax. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Everybody talks about the importance of culture. How do you do it? How do you know it's working? All kinds of questions related to that. Today, we're going to talk about how culture rules and the culture rules. Joining us today is Mark Miller. He is the author and co-founder of Lead Every Day, and he was the highest rated speaker at the NACS Leadership Forum that we had a couple months ago. So welcome, Mark.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I enjoyed being with you.
So we're going to talk about culture. We're going to talk about some other things, but one of the books that was the focus that you talked about at the Leadership Forum was called Culture Rules, and kind of set it up as kind of double meanings there. Do you want to talk about the two different meanings behind your title?
Sure. At the highest level, culture rules. And most famously, Peter Drucker said years and years and years ago that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And everything in an organization is impacted by culture. Well, we realized that there was a huge opportunity for organizations around the world to strengthen their culture, and we wanted to help them do that. And so after a multi-year study, including thousands of leaders around the world, we came up with some rules that we believe will help leaders translate their intentions into reality and create the culture of their dreams.
And you also have the bona fides that you have the experience in an environment that is rich in culture, having been employee number 16 or corporate employee number 16 at Chick-fil-A, which is pretty well known for culture. Yes. So you've been on this long journey. This isn't something that you said, hey, wow, culture's kind of popping there in the news. Let's do something about it. What was your first introduction? Well, how do you realize it was a big deal?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is we obviously at Chick-fil-A, to your point, have worked on strengthening our culture for decades. However, we had a lot of leaders in our organization, our restaurant operators, our corporate staff, and leaders around the world who were increasingly expressing their concerns and their challenges and their difficulties with creating the culture they wanted. And so we went to work not to document our journey at Chick-fil-A, but to learn so that we could import those lessons into our culture and our organization, which is why we always start projects like this with the question, what is universally true about this topic? And in this case, we said, well, let's go talk to leaders and frontline folks around the world. We interviewed, surveyed, or included in focus groups over 6,000 folks from 10 countries so that we would try and discern what is universally true. And that's what we built the book around.
And Mark, I believe you said it also that when you did that survey that culture didn't come in the top 10. Like it kind of came in around number 12.
Well, let me set just a little bit of context. Yes, your memory is very, very good, but there was a question before that one. We asked these leaders how important culture was, and they said that culture is the number one tool at their disposal to drive performance. In the U.S., it was 72% of leaders said, and by the way, there was nothing that scored higher. It's like a leader who wants to drive performance focuses on culture. So that was helpful, maybe, but not particularly insightful. It's the data point that you referenced that captured our imagination. We asked those same leaders globally to rate their priorities. And in the U.S., building and maintaining culture came in at number 12. And so I think, in a nutshell, that explains why so many organizations have awful cultures, is because leaders aren't working on culture. And leaders animate culture or not, right? You're going to have one. It's either by design or by default. And if you're not working on it, it's a culture by default. And they're never thriving. They're never vibrant. They're never healthy. In fact, many, many times they're toxic. And so these rules, we went to try and figure out how do we help leaders close that gap. They know it's the number one driver of performance, and yet it's number 12 on their priority list.
Every organization has a culture, like you said, but you may not like it.
You may not like it. And if you don't, again, this is hard truth, but I offer this in love. The leader's got to look in the mirror, right? The culture is a direct reflection of what leaders do or fail to do.
And I saw a lot of heads nod when you mentioned that those types of leaders are probably stuck in quicksand, right? It's like the more you move in quicksand, the more you're going to sink. So someone's going to throw you a rope.
Thank you, Chrissy, for bringing that up. This is a little bit of a detour, but Jeff, I want to go here for just a second. When we saw this gap, we said, okay, if we're going to help leaders close this gap, why is this gap there, right? If you know something most leaders I know care about performance. And if they know intellectually, unprompted, unaided, that culture is the lever, then why aren't they working on it? And I would say at a macro level, there are two reasons. One is they don't know how, which is what the culture rule's about. But I think there's an overarching reason, Chrissy just mentioned it, is that we had done some previous work a few years back on how to help leaders improve their effectiveness. Because we saw a lot of men and women who know how to lead, who by their own admission, they weren't leading to their full potential. And so we went to work, a very similar project, multi-year, multi-million-dollar project trying to figure out how to improve leadership effectiveness. And we determined that the primary culprit is what we call quicksand. It's a toxic mix, and it varies from person to person and season to season, but it's those things that are impeding your effectiveness. Typical ingredients include busyness, complexity, distractions, maybe some fear, maybe some fatigue, maybe even a measure of success is impeding you from going to the next level. And so we did that work to help leaders get out of quicksand. And the way it links here, as Chrissy referenced, is that leaders in quicksand aren't working on culture. They're working on survival, which sort of makes sense, right? But then by extension, if the leader's in quicksand, he or she can't help those around them out. So there's a really good chance the leaders around you are in quicksand. And it's a cascading effect of chaos. And nobody's working on culture. Even though you know in your heart you should be, you think, well, I've got to survive. And so we did that work. We published under the title of Smart Leadership. And I know we don't want to spend our time on that, but I'll offer your listeners the same thing I offered the group that Chrissy was part of. We've done a free assessment. And all you have to do is text "Be Smart" without a space, which I'm not sure was smart, but BESMART, text "Be Smart" to 66866. And we've got an assessment. And I'll give a shout out to the team that created this. This is not one of those things that when you do, you think, well, there's 10 minutes of my life I'll never get back. It's not one of those. It's behaviorally based. And you get recommendations based on your answers regarding things that may help you begin to get out of the quicksand. And so if you get out of quicksand, then we've got some culture rules for you that'll help you build a thriving high performance culture.
And of course, in our industry.
So thanks for bringing that up, Chrissy. I think that's a big deal for a lot of leaders. I meet far too many leaders they're trying to lead from quicksand. It's just really hard to do.
In our industry, quicksand would be misspelled with either a couple missing letters or
KW.
Yeah, all kinds of different ways.
QI.
Spell it however you want. But I think I haven't met an audience in the world yet that doesn't understand it. When I start describing it, everybody's going, oh, yeah, I've been there. So you just got to get out of it. You just can't do your best work in quicksand. And you're probably not going to do much work on culture.
And I was joking about our industry and the misspelling of quick. But our industry also, I was at the NACS Human Resources Forum a couple weeks ago. And they talked about not only do you have a different, your culture is something at the HQ level, every store has a culture. So what you were talking about is follow the leader. You look at what the leader is doing and whether that leader is the store manager or whether that leader is the CEO, you need to replicate what the behavior you want to see. And that's also a big focus of what you talk about.
Sure. Absolutely. And I can resonate with your point. Some of your audience may or may not know, I just recently retired from Chick-fil-A after almost 100 years. But my last event that our team hosted, we had almost 10,000 people in the room for 3.5 days, and we taught our restaurant operators and staff the content we're talking about. Because at the time when I left, we had over 3,000 restaurants. Each had its own culture. And the truth of it is you've then got micro cultures within that restaurant. You've got day shift, night shift, you got front of house, back of house, drive-through. And those micro cultures, they're not a bad thing as long as they're stewarded properly. You can't let them become countercultures, because then you got a problem. But I certainly understand the challenges of a decentralized culture. It's not a culture, it's many, M-A-N-Y, many cultures.
Yeah.
So I got you.
Line up pretty well. What Chick-fil-A and convenience stores, similar kind of things with all these different micro cultures. Is there one or two things? We always come up with excuses, quicksand, all these other things. But is there an example that you can cite with the work at Chick-fil-A that just kind of says, here's a shining example or two of how it works when it's working awesome? I think we've all seen examples in visiting stores, but from your side of the business, anything that people talk about that's legendary?
Well, there quite a few, and they revolve around. I don't know if you're really wanting to go here or not, but they do revolve around the 3 rules. So let me hit those really, really quick. The first rule is to aspire. The leader has to share your hopes and dreams for your culture, because you can't create it by yourself, right? It only becomes real. It only becomes the culture when others join you to make the aspiration a reality. And so we've got restaurant operators all over the country who for decades have been articulating their aspiration for their culture, rallying people around it to make it so. I'll share one example. I would say, to your question, a shining example, but it's a little offbeat, which I included it in the book because we typically think about vision and mission and values and purpose, and those are all mechanisms at a leader's disposal to help articulate your hopes and dreams, and I'm a fan of those things. But I included this story because it was a little different. There's a leader, a very successful leader in our organization, operates multiple restaurants, and I was talking to him about his culture, and the more I probed, he kind of caught where I was going, and he said, "Yeah, I don't really have those things you're talking about." I said, "Yeah, but how do you express your aspiration? Because your people are with you and they're aligned and you're doing amazing things." And he said, "Oh, it's the lighthouse." And he had a little pin on his lapel, and he had chosen, the way I describe it in the book, he chose an inanimate object to convey his aspiration. And he said, "How much do you know about lighthouses?" And I said, "Almost nothing." And he said, "Okay." He said, "Most people think they're a sign of danger." And he said, "That's one facet of it, but they're also a beacon of hope because they guided the ship safely home." And he said, "I want our place to be safe harbor for our guests." And so he literally has a lighthouse on the counter in his restaurant. All of his folks wear the little pin, and they talk to guests about it all the time. And so, but it was a clear aspiration, and it doesn't fit neatly or nicely into, well, what's your vision or what's your mission or what's your values or ethos? And again, those are all great mechanisms, but you don't even need to be confined by that. You just have to be able to share your aspiration in a way that is clear, simple, and repeatable, because you need everybody else to get it and to cascade it. And you ultimately want everybody talking about the aspiration. So to me, that's somewhat of a shining example, pun intended there. So that's one. Another example, the second rule is to amplify. And this is when the leader looks for ways to reinforce the aspiration. And you got to do this all the time. You mentioned one a moment ago as role modeling, and I'll share that as a shining example. Again, it's another story I included in the book. Dan Cathy, our former CEO, years and years and years ago, we were trying to improve quality, and we had feedback from guests. This was 30 plus years ago, that they were concerned about cleanliness in our restaurants. And Dan just developed the personal discipline of picking up trash. And people always watch the leader. So everybody picks up trash to this very day. And I've been with Dan Cathy when he picks up trash in a Walmart parking lot. He picks up trash in the McDonald's parking lot. I tell the story in the book about training my son to pick up trash in our neighborhood so he can take it home and throw it away, because people always watch the leader. And so that's just one of those strategies that, again, I would say you could list many, many ways to amplify an aspiration, but none will surpass the role modeling that the leader provides. Yeah. So I don't know if that prompts anything from you or not, but let me hit the third rule really quick, which is to adapt, to constantly be looking for ways to enhance the culture. There's a real risk because leaders, we love to get things done, and we'll have a clear aspiration and we'll amplify it and we'll see progress. I mean, I guarantee you that'll happen. You have a clear aspiration, you amplify it well, the culture will begin to shift toward your aspiration. Well, we've got to fight the tendency to check that box and go, culture, we're done. And maybe even worse than that is if you move into protection mode. You try to shrink wrap it, because what you'll ultimately do is you'll suffocate it. And so that's why we have to have the third culture rule, is to always be working to enhance the culture. Give you an example to your question in the restaurants. One of the strategies is certainly to close any critical gaps. If you've got them, that's fine. And another example would be to eliminate any toxins, any patterns of unhealthy or unproductive behavior. That sort of makes sense. But another strategy that I don't see enacted as often is double down on your strengths. And we've had some restaurants that have done that, where they had really good levels of hospitality, and they said, we're going to double down on it. We're going to take it to a new level and sustain it. If you don't sustain it, it's just a blip. But I think you've changed the culture when you raise the bar successfully and sustain it. Other restaurants have done that on order accuracy, that, maybe they're at 96, 97, 98%, which by industry standards is really good. And they say, no, we're going to get better. And when they do get better and sustain it, I would argue they have enhanced the culture. So there are a few examples that align with the rules. Yeah, there's a lot leaders can do if we'll focus on the culture.
So at the end of the day, how do we measure all this?
Great question. Love that question. All right, this is probably a whole episode. So I may have offered this disclaimer when I was with you, Chrissy. Please, to your audience, don't misinterpret the brevity of my response with the magnitude of that question. However, I do have a simple response here. The best measurement, I would argue the only appropriate measurement of culture, has to link to the aspiration. People say, is innovation a great measure of culture? I said, only if that's part of your aspiration. Is hospitality a great measure of culture? I would say, only if that's part of your aspiration. Now, you may measure those things as part of your scorecard for your business. I'm not even judging that. But as a cultural metric, I say you've got to go back to the aspiration and then figure out how to measure that. We want to be the world's Chick-fil-A. I'm not there anymore. I still say we. Chick-fil-A wants to be the world's most caring company. Well, then you got to measure, do people feel cared for? Now, you can still measure innovation. You can still measure all these other things, and they may be health indicators for your business. But, the old story, it's dated right now. For decades, 3M wanted to be known as an innovation company. Well, they tracked what percentage of their new products or what percentage of their sales came from new products. So I would say, whatever you want the culture to be, that's what you have to measure.
Yeah, it's similar to Sheets. Emily Sheets spoke at the NAC show last year and talked about, we seek a certain level of failure with innovation, because if we're not failing, then that means we're not pushing the envelope far enough. And thinking more about Chick-fil-A and just focusing on the hospitality. The commercials that they show now are all about the customer-employee relationship. You never see, or I haven't seen, 2 for $5 offers from Chick-fil-A. Got to be competitive on price, got to taste great, but a real focus on the customer-employee relationship and how that's special. And all the commercials just play through that. It's all culture.
Yeah. That's what we're working on. So hope that at least whets people's appetite when they're trying to create their culture scorecard. Go back to the aspiration, and that should give you clues as to what you should be measuring. Again, you may measure other things for other reasons, but don't confuse things on your scorecard with measures of your culture.
Now, podcast is about telling stories. And so in your book, you have a whole chapter dedicated to storytelling. And I love the first quote from Steve Jobs. And it is the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. And of course, as you develop the right culture, you want to tell the stories. And you talk about how when a story is well told, it releases hormones that make you feel that you trust the person telling the story. And so I thought that was a whole fascinating element about, it's not just like you say, oh, well, we have a good culture. You have to tell a good story. It has to have tension. It has to be, you can tell the difference between a good story and a bad story. A bad story is a series of facts. A good story just pulls you in, and then you always remember that story when somebody cites something related to that. So that's also the key element, that it's not enough to be exceptional. It's how do you continue to tell that have something exceptional going on.
Yeah, I think that's one of those very, very underrated and extremely powerful strategies to amplify an aspiration. We talked about role modeling. Storytelling is right there. Stories connect. The head, the heart, they're told well, they're memorable. And Plato said many, many, many years ago, what is honored in a country is cultivated there. And if you honor people through your stories, you will see more of those behaviors within your organization. So I encourage every leader to become a master storyteller.
And it's really no different. There's a lot of people cite sports a lot when they talk about business, and you do thing like this team, you'll succeed because it's all about teams. Those coaches, when they're in halftime or whatever sport they are, where they have quarters, innings, etc., there's a period where the best managers, the best coaches are spinning a tale that gets people all set to run through that wall, or all set to do what they didn't think they couldn't do.
Right. Yeah, it's a powerful way to amplify an aspiration, for sure.
So tying everything together, we know convenience stores, Chick-fil-A, similarities there. One of the things you also say in the book is just don't forget there's no cash registers in the home office. The store is where it's at, and you have to support all that. How is there a way that somebody could start thinking a little differently if they aren't thinking that way right now?
Wow. That's probably an even bigger question than the measurement question. Thank you, Jeff, here at the end of our time. Well, I think you ought to start talking about the fact that the business is in the field. I mean, I think we talked about that all the time, just to remind each other. I mean, not to minimize the importance of the work that you do at a corporate headquarters or a support center. We call the Chick-fil-A headquarters the support center, because we exist to support the men and women running those restaurants. That is where the cash registers are. So I think you can just increase the rhetoric, and then I think you've got to work to align your behaviors, particularly if you're in leadership, because you want alignment between what you say and what you do. And I would encourage leaders specifically, but up and down an organization, can you spend more time in the restaurants or in the field or in the stores talking to customers, talking to employees? You'll learn so much. You'll learn about things that you need to change in your culture. You'll learn about things that are working in your culture. You'll spot problems and you'll understand their solutions. Those closest to the problems are often closest to the solutions. But many times we're too far removed to connect with their reality. So yeah, I'm going to look at the data and I'm going to read the reports, but I'm going to do everything I can to spend time in the field where the real business is taking place. And I would just ask folks to look at your calendar for the last 30 days. How much time did you spend in your stores? Regardless of the answer, don't beat yourself up, but now look at the next 30 days and say, when can I get in the field? How can I get in the field more often? And I think reminding people where the business is transacted and then spending time there are probably my two top recommendations.
And that's, of course, Chrissy and I take a lot of road trips and a lot of right-hand turns to go visit places. We also heard that your exact message at the NACS Day of the Industry Summit in April, last week, 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. One of the companies said, even people in IT, we want them in stores once a week because they're coming up with solutions. Technology is not a solution. Technology is an enabler to a solution, and you need to see what the solutions are needed in stores. So I thought that was a really insightful comment, because there's a department that you always think, well, their back office, they'll just come up with whatever we tell them to do. But the store tells you what to do, and that's where all the action's at.
Yeah.
So, Mark, thank you very much. Like I said, you were the top-rated speaker at the Leadership Forum. Big buzz after that session. You have a couple books out, available for speaking, available for guidance. Where's the best way to reach you for anybody that's looking to get a hold of you?
The very best way is my cell phone. So that number is 678-612-8441. And so anybody who's driving, I hope you'll put that in the show notes for them, 678-612-8441. My email is mark@leadeveryday.com. And then our website is leadeveryday.com. So if I can serve you or our team can serve you, just reach out and we'll see if we can add value.
Well, you've been great in adding value at our meetings and on the podcast. So thank you for joining us today.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.